thank all of you who have joined us for our program today. I'm very excited to be discussing two of the great artists of the American West. On the left, Frederick Remington, and on the right, Charles M. Russell. These two artists have had a tremendous impact on the history of the American West and how the West is perceived. And they make a wonderful comparison because they have so much in common and so much of great difference. And you begin to sense a little of this in looking at their portraits. Both of these are very formal portraits, but Remington on our left was an Easterner who visited the West and always remained an Easterner. A very dapper figure with his mustache just turned up a little, a very stout and commanding figure, and a prominent and significant member of New York society. On the right, Charles M. Russell, a man who grew up in what we regard today as the West, or the Midwest, really, in St. Louis, Missouri area, but moved to Montana when he was almost 16 years old and became a very firmly rooted Westerner. Even though he's wearing a formal suit jacket and tie, he's got his Western hat and a sense more of informality with his hat tipped back. And you see his ever unruly hair just peeking out of the hat brim. His demeanor's a little fierce in this picture, but I think it's mostly from not wanting to be photographed because he had a very jovial personality and was one of those men who was well liked. He never met a stranger and always interacted well with his compadres. Notice, although he has a tie and a shirt, it's a little more wrinkled and not quite as neatly tied as Frederick Remington. So, and you sense that a little more in his caricature. This is a letter that Charles M. Russell wrote back to his friends. He was back in his home state of Missouri, and it was much more formal than his Western area, and he showed himself caricatured as he dressed in formal clothing, but he managed to have one Western item, his fur trader's sash, red sash that he always wore and became almost a symbol of Charles M. Russell. He wrapped that around his formal suit, and he showed his friends back in Montana how uncomfortable he was in these fancy duds. Both Remington and Russell were prolific artists, and they were artists who worked in a variety of media. And I do find this shows both their tremendous artistic talent and their endeavoring spirits in attacking almost any type of art. Both of them began really as painters and drawers, and each one of them also did work in 3 dimensions and sculpture. Remington entered a little later in his career. Russell was always making little wax sculptures, but he only later began making formal works. And both of them wrote about their experiences. They wrote fiction, and Remington wrote novels, and Charles M. Russell wrote stories that really were kind of like folklore. And each of them wrote letters to their friends. And Russell became especially known for the illustrated letters that he wrote that were a combination of works of art with elaborate watercolor and pen and ink drawings, as well as often humorous text. Remington wrote an occasional illustrated letter, but mostly he used his letters for direct verbal communication. But there we'll see the depth of their careers. We'll go back and talk a little bit about the life stories of each of the artists. They were roughly contemporaries, at least in the beginning. Frederick Remington was born in 1861. Charles M. Russell born in 1864. So only a few years apart. Geographically, they were somewhat distant. Frederick Remington was born in Canton, New York, which is far upstate in New York, near the St. Lawrence River, and not too far from the Canadian border. Charles Russell, born in Missouri, to a family that had some Western history, and he grew up longing to go to the far West. Both artists were really from middle class and even upper middle class families. Both of them had significant schooling, but neither was a particularly great student. Each one of them had time in military school, and Frederick Remington went on to Yale University, where he studied for art and studied for about a year and a half before his father passed away and he returned home. Remington's father had been very important to him. His father had been in the military in the Civil War, and I think that always affected Remington's views on the military. Russell's family was in business. He also had a stint in military school, but was not a successful student and begged his family to let him go to Montana, where his family had connections. And finally, when he was just about 16, they allowed him to go, thinking that he would visit and come back, but he ended up staying in Montana essentially for the rest of his life. Both of these artists were self-trained as artists. Remington did have some study at Yale University and later some classes at the Art Student League, but essentially he learned on his own. Russell was reported to have been enrolled in an art class that he despised and dropped out of. There's not a lot of history on that subject. But it's important to acknowledge that each one of them, although they did not do a lot of formal study, they learned so much by looking at other works of art and reproductions of works of art. Russell, who came to a formal career as an artist a little later than Remington, actually studied the works of Remington as they were published in books and magazines. So they were two artists that found their way independently, and each of them was quite pragmatic in the way they approached art. They believed and they built their career on the fact that what they knew was conveyed through art, and their art was valuable because of what they knew. Because they began essentially as self-taught, they each learned a lot as they progressed as artists. On the left is an early work of Frederick Remington's, Cowboy Fun. This was an illustration, and this is really how Remington began his career. His first trip to the the West was in 1881, and that is similar timing to Charles M. Russell, who traveled about 1880. So they both had their encounters with the far West about the same time. Remington sputtered in trying to find a career, and after his first trip to the West was really just as kind of an adventure, like the students who take off a year after high school and go and travel. That's what Remington was doing. He settled down and tried some business jobs and was not successful, and eventually decided that he was going to pursue his art. And he found a way to do that, doing illustrations and really almost working as a journalist, traveling to the West, recording what he saw, primarily in drawings, because they were going to be included as wood engravings in magazines of the day. And he got a plum assignment to illustrate the book actually the articles that Theodore Roosevelt was writing about his experiences on Dakota ranches. And this is long before Roosevelt was president. And Remington used both his knowledge and photographs of cowboy life to do a wonderful series of pen and ink illustrations for Roosevelt's book. Charles M. Russell, in going west, and at first worked actually as a cowboy. When he went west, he lived for a while with a trapper, and finally was able to get employment with ranches in the Montana area. And he painted and drew on the side until he was finally able in the 1890s to quit cowboy work and devote himself to his art full time. So each of the artists, after some missteps, began their careers full time and successfully devoting themselves to art. In this early work of Russell's, I want you to notice his limited color palette. It's basically a very brown, and he uses some highlights of primary colors. Particularly, we see reds and yellows in the representation of the Native American gear. This is the period in Russell's career where he's really learning how to paint and learning how to deal with color in very almost baby steps. Each of the artists, they're developed very strongly on their own, and by the 1900s, each of them was quite successful. This is one of Frederick Remington's major paintings, Halt, Dismount, 1901, just after the turn of the century. And this is a watercolor by Charles M. Russell that was actually enclosed with a letter, a beautiful scene of a roundup of buffalo. By the time that Russell wrote this letter in 1909, he had made 2 trips to New York City, where he both had exhibitions of his work, and yet he met other artists of the American West and learned from them by observing their work, by consulting with them. And he lightened his palette considerably and was able to work with a broad range of colors while still maintaining his beautiful application of form. I want to look especially, though, at how each of the artists approached subject matter of the American West, because I think that's where we see much of their contributions as well as some of their differences. Both Remington and Russell did some paintings and sculptures of military subjects or subjects of law and order, but Remington much more so, because when he traveled in the American West, Remington primarily in the early years traveled in the company of the US Army. That enabled him to travel safely. It gave him some guidance, and it gave him subjects that were particularly important to him. He greatly admired the military life and the military man, although he never himself enlisted. He had the heritage from his father, and he admired the bravery and the fortitude of military men traveling in wilderness areas, and he expressed that in the painting of the well in the desert, where we see the cavalrymen coming up to a well with the very precious resource of water, but there in the desert. Traveling with the Army gave him access to areas that he might not have known about, but it also gave him a viewpoint of alignment with the United States government in its efforts to control territories in the American West, and in its role in opposition to the native inhabitants of the continent. Russell, on the other hand, painted far less scenes of the military, but he tended more to identify with not exactly the outlaw, but maybe those who were kind of on the fringes of society, the outsider, the not so formal life. One big exception seemed to be the subject of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. On your right is a detail from a letter by Russell to Mr. Ralph Kendall, who had been a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and had written a book about it, and sent a copy to Russell, and Russell thanked him, and then did this wonderful little drawing of a Canadian Mountie on horseback with that distinctive red jacket. And he did a number of paintings, especially after he had gone to the Calgary Stampede in Calgary, Alberta, with the Royal Mounted Police as subjects. And I think one reason he could be more attracted to that subject was that he tended to see them as individuals, even though they were obviously part of a large contingent. But his other paintings, when he showed the mounted police, often showed like one Mountie going into a village of Indian people to make an arrest, and a sort of standoff between the Mountie and the Indian. Remington, as well, had a particular experience with his military. In the 1880s, in 1888 actually, he traveled with the 10th Cavalry in Arizona Territory. And the 10th Cavalry was the regiment of African-American soldiers, commonly called Buffalo Soldiers. And they were led by white officers, but the the 10th Cavalry was otherwise completely composed of African Americans, many whom had joined the army after the Civil War. And in 1888 and 89, Remington made a number of sketches of time with the Buffalo Soldiers and published them in Century Magazine in the story about his time with the Buffalo Soldiers. And he used a number of the sketches in some other paintings where he showed Black cavalrymen. Remington definitely was a man who had the racial prejudices of his own time. And he is known for having written some rather racist letters. And yet, from his time in traveling with the 10th Cavalry, he came to admire greatly the soldiers. And in his article, essentially tried to counter some of the current thinking, which was that these African Americans couldn't possibly be as brave and courageous as white soldiers. And he wrote in his article that he had observed that they definitely could fight. And he did scenes that showed a soldier saving a white soldier. And so he made, at least in these early works of the military, an effort to translate what he was seeing and bring it to a larger audience. This is a pen and ink sketch that he did while he was traveling. And I believe that in the far left, there's this small vignette of a figure with a kind of pit helmet. And he's standing rather resolutely. And then there's a second figure bent over. I think the figure with the helmet is Frederick Remington, and he's inserted a little self-portrait into this picture of a campfire sketch. It's a small detail, and I think it was probably one of the efforts to say I was there and I witnessed this by including his self-portrait along with the scene of the Black cavalry riders at their breakfast over the cooking fire, as he called it. This particular pen and ink sketch is an acquisition that the Stark Museum has made, and we've not yet had it on view because it needs some treatment from conservation, and we're looking on doing that and exhibiting it in the coming year, and hope I'll be able to do another presentation, maybe looking more closely at Remington's A Campfire Sketch in relation to his trip to Arizona. Remington so admired the military that he also wrote a novel in which military scenes play a large role. His novel was called John Erman of the Yellowstone, and this is one of the illustrations from that book in its painting form. And John Erman is on the right of the composition on horseback. He's acting as a scout. He's going to ride out of the scene, and instead we're confronted really with the military and with this is the device that Remington uses of showing the blast of the rifle fire and how it's affecting the ground as they're being shot at as well. And it's causing rising of little dust areas. This is one of the paintings that he did in shades of gray. And we often are asked, well, why did he paint in gray? And this was one of the realities of the printing industry at that time. This painting was made to be an illustration in a book. And by the 1900s, printing techniques had improved so that the camera could be used to photograph the artist's original work of art and print it instead of having to have a wood engraving laboriously made copying the painting. But the camera at that time and the printing was working only in black and white. And thus it made it easier or more appropriate if the artist actually painted in shades of gray and black and white so that it translated exactly when it was printed. So Remington, in his early career, did the pen and ink drawings for wood engravings, and he did paintings in black and white and gray for photographic reproduction, like bullets kicked up the dust. And sometimes we, in a fancy way, call this grisaille, which is a French term for shades of gray. And it goes back to actually medieval artists often painted in shades of gray to imitate sculpture, stone sculpture. But I think Remington just called it black and white. You can see in his painting Halt, Dismount how he again deals with the subject of the military, an impending battle. And in this case, we actually see the antagonist in the distance, Indians riding, and they're shooting toward the cavalry. And there we see very dramatically the plumes of dust arising from where the bullets are hitting the ground. Halt, Dismount shows the beautiful composition that Remington developed at this time with the line of troops coming into the canvas from the far right, building to the left. It's a very characteristic composition that he used quite often. You notice the landscape is very important, but it's really just a stage setting for the action of the human figure. Remington and Russell were both storytellers. They were very narrative artists. And the land was important, but it really just provided that setting for what the action that was going to happen. He has a little bit of foreboding in the foreground with the painted buffalo skull to indicate that death is ever present here in this landscape. I want to use this painting as well to look at how this was one that he did in 1901, but it was in color, and it was never intended as an illustration. This was a private commission. But had he wanted to illustrate it, on the right, I've shown you a black and white photograph of that painting. And there is, in Halt, Dismount, there's a lot of good, strong contrast. Look at the wonderful pinto pony that the Indian scout is riding with its areas of red and white. That shows up in the black and white. But some of the color often is this similar value. Notice that the soldier's pants, that nice gray, shows up very well against the bay horses, that sort of reddish brown. But if you look then at the black and white, the legs and the horses are basically the same value of light and dark, and the legs start disappearing, especially with the figure in with the dark shadow. So for the artist to go to paint in black and white and gray, he can work around and change the value enough to highlight the areas he needs to highlight. Remington felt that caused him troubles when he wanted to paint in color, that he'd spent so much time painting in black and white and gray that that he had difficulties with color. One of the ways he did that was to look at other artists' works of art. He was especially cognizant of the work of the American Impressionists especially in Connecticut. He observed the work of Impressionists, and he supposedly said, "My aunt can knit a better painting than that." But he was looking at them, and he was incorporating their use of brushstrokes. In fact, you'll really have to come and look at Halt Dismount, because it has beautiful brushwork, and it almost does look like he's knitting. The way he varies his strokes and actually works them in a very clear pattern of interlocking brushstrokes that is quite beautiful in its own right. Now, for Remington, the Indian was almost always conceived as an enemy, and that comes from his military background. So we see that in his sculpture with the Cheyenne. We see on the left his sculpture of a Cheyenne Indian riding dramatically across the plains. He seems to be at one with his horse. He holds his spear in the left hand, and his countenance is fierce and dramatic. I'm going to come back to the sculpture later. Charles M. Russell did do scenes of Indian battles and of some conflict, but he tended to focus more on an idealization of Indian life. He looked back, by the time he was painting and making sculpture, most of the Indian people in Montana area were settled on reservations, and their ways of life were being circumscribed by government agents who required them to give up their ways of life and religion. And Russell looked back to a time when the Indian was free to pursue his life the way he wanted to. His sculpture, Meat for Wild Men, shows hunting and buffalo hunting, a very popular subject throughout Russell's career. Painted hundreds of paintings of buffalo hunts. Russell also, he showed interaction with white men that was not always in conflict. In signaling approach of white men on the right, he's showing the future incursion of white people into the lands where the Indian people resided. But at the point of this painting, it's still it basically is an unknown. We see the signal at the top as the blankets are being raised. We see riders coming fiercely in, but it's not a scene of a threat. In fact, one figure is in great contemplation as he sits with his jaw and his head firmly in his hand, and deep in thought. So Russell could include scenes that foretold coming changes, and he, as an artist and a Westerner, accepted those changes himself but he lamented the passing of the ways of the old. Frederick Remington, and he shouted his harsh pathos, did a scene that we would consider as an evocation of sort of the vanishing Indian, the last of the Indians, as we have seen in James Earl Fraser's sculpture, The End of the Trail, and John McStanley's painting the last of their tribe. This painting was done as an illustration also for a novel that Frederick Remington wrote, The Way of an Indian, a tale of a Cheyenne Indian who led a doomed and tragic life. And this is his, we sense his final moment, not quite final, but he's standing at the edge of a precipice. The ground is frozen with snow, and he's calling to the great spirit above. His life is doomed. He's carrying his young son wrapped in his buffalo robe, and there's no future for that young child as well. So Remington tended to show the vanishing race as vanishing completely, although he very well understood many of the realities of Indian existence at that time. Neither of these artists depicted many paintings of women. It must be noted that they are definitely showing the masculine presence in the American West. But and they did do a few paintings with women, or paintings and sculpture with women in them. And when they did, it tended to be an Indian woman. So women were not only the other, but they were further removed as the other as an Indian as well as a woman. On the left, Frederick Remington's, it's a printed photomechanical print from one of his illustrations, and it was done as an illustration of a story. So he had to include a female figure. Russell included more paintings of women and more that, especially of Indian women, showing them in their domestic life, so that he gave a fuller picture of Indian life, showing, in this case, this sculpture is based on a wax model that Russell did of an Indian woman showing her child to the sun gods. So he tended to show more domestic scenes to include the women in the life of the Indian peoples, but sometimes exoticized. But for both of these artists, the major subject was the cowboy. Both of them painted and sculpted the cowboy and became well known for their images. Russell was often called the cowboy artist. Remington never worked as a cowboy. He did briefly own a sheep ranch in Kansas. Was not very successful at that. But he made efforts, particularly in the latter part of his career, to visit ranches. Went to Mexico to visit Mexican cowboys and to observe ranch life as much as possible. Both of them became known for their sculptures of cowboys and bucking horses. And we have on the left, Remington's The Bronco Buster. On the right, Russell's Where the Best of Riders Quit. And this is, I think, a really good comparison, because in Remington's, we see the Bronco Buster. He is literally taming the Bronco. He's holding on. He does have one foot out of the stirrup, which is dangerous. but is with his quirt on the right hand and his left hand grabbing the reins and the mane. He is maintaining control over this. We have the tension embodied in the horse and in the rider, but we sense that the cowboy is going to remain mastering this scene in the saddle. Russell goes to the far extent. He tells us in the title of this work that this is a good rider. This is one of the best. And yet there's a moment that he has to quit. He shows us with the cowboy, he barely has one foot in the stirrup. One is flying free. He's barely holding on. And the horse is about to go over backwards, which is one of the most dangerous things that can happen. And so we know that in this case, the cowboy is going to leave the mount and preserve himself. And this is a little bit example of the humor that Charles M. Russell inserted into a number of his works. It also shows, I think, one of the differences of the two artists is as they are sculptors, in that Remington sculptures, although they're action-packed and very narrative, usually have one prominent view, and we see that straight on when we look at the Bronco Buster. Russell could have one view, but he really much more dramatically modeled in the round. And we see that with the Best of Riders Quit, where we have a very different and equally good view. If we orient the sculpture this way, or if we walk completely around it, or even this view where we see really what is happening to the horse, and how this is really a very terrifying moment as he's about to go over. Both of them did various interpretations of the bucking bronco. With Remington, we have the rattlesnake, where nature is providing the reason for the bucking. With Russell on the right, a bronc twister. It is the horse itself. He's near sagebrush, but the point of the sagebrush actually is to create balance. Both of these artists were trying so hard to show action and movement in their sculptures that they were really defying the limits of gravity. And Russell had to use the sagebrush as a point of balance in his sculpture. Remington was so intrigued with the rattlesnake that he reworked the sculpture and did a later version, a little more monumental than the earlier version. And he just changed the position. You're much more aware of the horse's interaction with the rattlesnake, and each of them is interesting, but I think his success in changing can be seen in the later version. In general, Remington tended to have more monumental feel and more attention to form rather than the surface. Although in this version of the rattlesnake, he has the woolly chaps, which he has the wonderful texture of those chaps, which was really made possible by the foundry that he was working with, Roman Bronze Works. It was very important that he found a foundry that could do the kinds of sculpture that he wanted to do. And Remington always worked closely with his foundry. Russell used the same foundry, Roman Bronze Work, but he liked making the original sculpture, modeling in wax. He tended to work very much from his hand. So his sculptures tend to be smaller and you have a greater sense of the handwork. And his wife really was the negotiator with the foundry and the one who made sure that the foundry was able to meet their standards in casting the bronzes. The Bucker and the Buckaroo, one of his late sculptures, really gives an example of also the three-dimensional character of his sculpture of a bucking bronco. This is when you really can walk completely around to get wonderful different views. And we call it a lifetime cast because it was cast by his wife even after he died, but she was the one who was making the decisions about how the bronzes appeared. There's another view of the Bucker and Buckaroo, a wonderful view. Both artists could enjoy the high life of the cowboy. Remember Remington's early drawing of cowboy fun. He took to great lengths with his sculpture of Coming Through the Rye, where he shows cowboys coming into town after being out on the range, and they're shooting their guns, they're riding with great ferocity, they're coming for a good time. This is one of the sculptures where Remington sought to break away from the solid nature of bronze. He wanted to show the horses in motion. He wanted to show them with all their legs off the ground, which of course was totally impossible, but he was able to show at least one horse with all of its legs off the ground by attaching and balancing it with the horse next to it. Russell did numerous humorous paintings of cowboy life, and he also included them in some of his letters. This is one of his New Year's card where a cowboy has been imbibing, and he gives a toast. Here's to the trail behind you, looking at that past year. And both of them could show both the drudgery and sometimes the danger of cowboy life. Remington's riding herd in the rain, and Russell's a dangerous situation. So they each studied life from its experiences. Russell very directly, and he's greatly admired by Westerners because of his cowboy experience. Each of them did wildlife. Russell much more because he did the small sculptures, and his, bears, buffalo were his subjects. Remington, when he included wildlife, it was part of a hunting scene, as we see in Heroes. Both of them wanted to be regarded as authorities on the horse. As part of their knowledge of cowboys, Remington, as we see in the Cheyenne, this was also an effort at showing all of the horse's legs off the ground. He was very proud for his knowledge of the motion of horses. He studied Muybridge's photographs to learn that, but he incorporated it into a sculpture and then balanced the sculpture by making the buffalo robe showing. Russell did sculptures even of the wild horses, the range horses of the West, showing not the elegant cavalry horses of Remington, but the throws of the Mustangs. And each of them approached Western history. Remington looking back to the mountain man, Charles Russell looking back to the early days of California and the Hispanic presence in the West. Both of them admired the Mexican cowboy and saw his influence important in the American West. And it was that subject of the cowboy that occupied both of them toward the end of their life. Charles Russell, living much longer than Frederick Remington, Russell eventually had complications of that occurred from his liver disease, and he drew his last Christmas card in October before he passed away, and his wife printed it posthumously. And it's again that looking back, here's hoping the worst end of the trail is behind you. Remington, toward the very end of his life, He died suddenly in 1909 from complications of appendicitis. And at that time, he was working on a revamped version of the Bronco Buster, making it larger, more monumental, and addressing it in a way that I think even more dramatically, the cowboy has tamed the far West. Each of these artists leaves us a wonderful legacy of interpretations of the West. They've left us some of the stereotypes and some of their omissions we continue to grapple with. But I think by looking at their careers and what they accomplished, we can find points to see how the West has continued to influence us to today. So thank you.